Good evening and welcome. I am William Jew. I want to thank you for joining us this Sunday. Some of you at 1 in the afternoon in Hawaii, some of you at 8 tomorrow morning in Korea. Some of you are pursuing your education at universities spanning from California to Europe, and some of you are on American military bases around the world. Wherever our profession and the quest for wisdom have scattered us, each of you was willing to take the time out of your day to sit in one room to listen to great teachers, old and new, who I will confess with some pride, taught many of the military officers on this call.
Before we turn to our main event, let us tell you what the Foundation Society is and why it exists. I'm Gary Fuller, West Point class of 2023. I previously served at 3rd ID at Fort Stewart, and now I'm the Executive Officer for Army Recruiting in Salt Lake City, Utah. Part of my daily work and my current assignment is administering the Oath of Enlistment. Over time, it became apparent to me that many of us do not sufficiently understand the Constitution we swear our lives to, and many of us, including myself, have not sufficiently read and studied its foundations. Our Constitution is the outcome of a long tradition of asking what justice is, what a good regime looks like, and what rights are afforded to us from our Creator. The Foundation Society is dedicated to reviving Western civic education and engaged citizenship. Two teachers who have been instrumental in our own education join us today.
Dr. Hugh Liebert is Professor of Political Science at West Point, Director of the Dawkins Graduate Scholars Program, and co-director of the American Foundation's Minor. He holds a doctorate from the Committee on Social Thought at Chicago, and he is the author of the award-winning Plutarch's Politics and Gibbon's Christianity. He will speak for Plato. Dr. Robert McDonald is Professor of History at West Point and co-director of the same American Foundation's Minor. He graduated from Virginia, read at Oxford, holds a doctorate from Chapel Hill, and is the author of Confounding Father, Thomas Jefferson's Image in His Own Time, and editor of Thomas Jefferson's Military Academy. He will speak for Jefferson. To the audience, please follow along using the flyer. Following the disputations, moderated by myself and Gary, the floor is yours and I encourage you to use it. This is a society that hopes to cultivate engaged citizens, and one way to be engaged is to question. We will begin at Disputation 1. The Republic begins with a catabasis, a descent. I went down to the Piraeus. Every reader of the book makes that descent with Socrates. In the summer of 1814, an old man and a young republic made it too, and he did not enjoy the trip. Jefferson wrote to Adams that he had, quote, amused himself with reading seriously Plato's Republic. He asks how it could have been that the world should have so long consented to give reputation to such nonsense, and he complains of, quote, the whimsies, the puerilities, and unintelligible jargon of this work. Adams wrote back that he had forced himself through all of Plato, and, quote, my disappointment was very great, my astonishment was greater, and my disgust was shocking. He learned, he says, exactly two things from Plato. One was where Ben Franklin had plagiarized the idea about exempting farmers from war, and the other was, quote, sneezing is a cure for the hiccups. And yet, and here's the question I want to put before our two guests, Socrates admits at the end of Book 9 that his city exists only as a pattern laid up in heaven for a man who wants to order his own soul, a city in speech echoed later by St. Augustine's City of God. While Jefferson, the man who dismissed him, pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor to found a city of man, a city indeed. And furthermore, during his leadership of our republic, he founded the United States Military Academy at West Point, where today men and women are selected at a relatively young age because of their capacities for leadership, courage, self-discipline, and responsibility, and are subjected to a regime of education and virtue and gymnastics, eating and living together in common mess halls, far from the oversight of our biological parents. He also spent his final decade building another Platonic academy, Dr. McDonald's alma mater, and an institution I had the privilege of attending for a short year, the University of Virginia. The question stated is, was Callipolis, the beautiful city, ever meant to be built? And as a supplementary question, would Jefferson, or for that matter, Plato himself, have preferred the city of pigs?
I mean, I feel like I should go first, Will, since I have to respond on behalf of Plato to all of these vicious attacks. I've just been quoted. But before I do, and I promise I will, I want to say thank you to the Foundation Society, to Will and Gary. I know Dr. McDonald shares my sentiments that it is extraordinarily gratifying to see two of our favorite students come back and to put this together and see so many other favorite students on the call, which is really great. I would love to run this just as a seminar and hear what everyone has been up to and thinking about, but I gather we're supposed to say things with some authority, so I guess we'll do that instead. But before I do, I just want to say I'm especially gratified to see Paul Conroy and Kamek Shepler in the room because I hear that there was a rehearsal where they were my body double yesterday. So they are now part of my tag team. And if you ask me any very hard questions, Will or Gary, I'm going to call them in and they will speak on Plato's behalf. At least help me.
Sounds good, sir.
All right, good. You're good. And then just lastly, it's such a pleasure. My dear friend and colleague, Rob McDonald, and I do so many wonderful things together that I really, really enjoy. And talking about Jefferson and Plato, I don't know that we've done before, but this is going to be really fun. So I'm looking for this. All right. So the question was, is Callipolis meant to be realized? And what about the city of pigs? So I'll try to answer briefly, and then I turn it over to Rob to speak on Jefferson's path. So meant to be built. In a certain sense, explicitly not. In a certain sense, kind of. In that, the name of Plato's book is not actually the Republic. That's part of a propaganda campaign that Cicero launched to convince Romans and other spirited citizens of republics that they could read Plato and it would be okay. The name of the book, though, is Politeia, which is roughly translated regime. So Plato's contention in this book, through his great protagonist Socrates, is that there are 5 distinct ways that human beings can order themselves together in society. And he wants to suggest to us that the best of them he calls aristocracy, the rule of the best people, the most virtuous. Second worst, democracy, rule of the people. But there are 5 varieties. In a certain way, every regime aspires to be an aristocracy. Democracy wants to be ruled by the best. It wants to say that by means of election, by means of granting everyone equal rights, we can both recognize the natural truth of human equality and recognize certain degrees of inequality that are relevant to ruling well, living well and politically. And so in a way, we can have the best of both worlds, I think. So in that sense, democracy and every other regime tries to be an aristocracy. Socrates is critical of that. He says, on the one hand, aristocracy is kind of realizable in that everyone's reaching for it all the time. In another sense, though, every other regime, apart from aristocracy, is bound to decline and fall and slip away from the true best regime. And so he wants to show us what the best really is. And it might be imaginary, but it's still realistic as an ideal that we can strive for. So that's the sort of. In the no, not meant to be realized at all sense, this elaborate thought experiment he engages in is supposed to be a metaphor for the soul. So even if it's the case that he doesn't persuade you that you can realize the best regime, I hope we have a chance to talk about all the strange institutions he recommends and whether or not they could be realized. But even if you don't believe that, right, you don't think that his political proposal makes sense, he wants to persuade you that your soul, what each of us individually is, myself, all of you, the way we are structured as human beings, points towards a kind of perfection that we can strive for individually and have a far greater chance of achieving than we can achieve perfection on the political level. So in that sense, yes, absolutely, he means it to be realized. Does he like the city of pigs? He does not like the city of pigs, I think. The city of pigs is a city he considers early on in the dialogue that's geared just towards human necessity. There's no philosophy in the city of pigs, and there's no meat eating. Those two go together. So he's in favor of meat eating and in favor of philosophy, and therefore is against the city of pigs. Over to you, Dr. McDonald.
Sounds good. I don't know that I can top your analysis there, but I will point out that as we were discussing about 30 minutes ago over the phone, Jefferson didn't think much of Plato in both meanings of the word. He didn't think often about Plato, it seems, and he didn't have a high opinion of Plato, as the exchange with John Adams makes pretty clear. But he did think a lot about the unique opportunity that the founding generation had to not just inherit government that had been passed down to them, but to reinvent their government in small r Republican forms. And this occurred on the state level, this occurred on the national level. They invented, they reinvented. So they are definitely thinking broadly about these issues, and they are engaged in, I think, what they would describe as a pretty perilous, precarious, fragile experiment in self-government. And they understood that not only did they need to get their constitutions right, but they also understood that the constitution of American citizens, the makeup, the character, the virtues of the people they were relying upon to govern themselves as individuals, as well as, collectively, as citizens who voted and held office. They needed to perfect their internal constitutions as well.
Thank you two very much. Moving on to Disputation 2. In the privacy of Crito, Socrates speaks on behalf of the law, in contradiction to his public apology. Speaking as the law, he says the first rule of any state is that citizens are not free to set aside the rules as a matter of personal conscience, to choose among them which ones to obey and disobey. His reasoning is that the questioning or breaking of so much as a single law is anarchy, since it calls into question the authority of capital L law, which the citizen owes his very existence to. We are who we are because of the nomos, the conventions, the culture and traditions that have regulated our parents' marriage, our nurture and education. And in this sense, the laws have begat us and possess more than just a paternal authority over us. He says your country, quote, is more to be valued and higher and holier than far than mother or father. And so Socrates, convicted unjustly, holding that we must never, quote, render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered, drinks the hemlock, claiming to be a victim not of the laws, but of men. 22 centuries later from Jefferson, quote, the earth belongs usufruct to the living, the dead have neither powers nor rights over it. Jefferson to William Smith, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. And in the declaration he authored, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. But the declaration is careful to indict a king by appeal to, quote, the laws of nature and of nature's God. And so the questions, does the law rightfully convict all 56 signers of the Declaration as corruptors who deserve death?
I'll say no. and I'll say it because, well, this could be a short answer or a long one. I guess I'll aim for something that's medium. What follows from Jefferson's preamble and the Declaration of Independence is this very long list of grievances, some quite specific things that the king has done or has allowed his government to do that violate the rights that we have government to protect in the first place. I mean, the magical sentence of the Declaration is in the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it's really all there. The purpose of government and the process of government. The purpose of government is to secure rights. And the British government had not been. It had been trampling upon their rights. And the process by which we are to govern ourselves is through popular consent. We're going to elect representatives who will make the laws under which we'll live. And they can exercise their just powers. They can't make just any old law. The laws that they make have to protect our natural rights. So I think from the vantage point of 1776, it would be treason not to sign your name to the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, the Declaration even makes the argument that the king has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. So, the Declaration has it as if we've been sort of cast out and we find ourselves in a state of nature. And so to secure our rights, we need to create a new government.
Okay. Yeah. So the question of the status of law in Plato is a very difficult question, and I have to fight the temptation, like Dr. McDonald did, to speak for hours on that question. Let me just say, one of the interesting things about trying to study Plato and speak on Plato's behalf is that it's very hard to understand exactly what he meant, even what Socrates as a character in most of his dialogues means. Jefferson, in this letter, we read, says, and I'll quote him, thousands of volumes have not yet explained the Platonisms engrafted on them, and for this obvious reason, that nonsense can never be explained. He's put down. But one of the problems he points to, and Adams seems to take up too, is that there are a lot of different dialogues. I mean, we have 35 of them that come down to us under Plato's name. In the Crito, he says, you should obey laws, even unjust laws. In the Apology, he speaks against unjust laws. The Republic actually opens with a critique of all law, not just unjust laws, but just laws too. That points out that every law, even a very good law, is going to have to face some exception where it's just to violate the law. So his example is, do you give a knife back to a crazy person who was sane when he gave you the knife? And he says, no, you don't do that. So every law, even the really good ones, like give back and do what you say you're going to do and so on, they all have exceptions. So I think the way that, that Plato would set us up to think about this is, what are the right kind of motives for violating traditions, for revising traditions, for even declaring revolution? And I think the way he would frame the question is really, what are the motives for that? Are they the sorts of things that a just person could do out of commitment to principle, to reason? Or are the fundamental motives for doing this sort of thing anger, resentment, the sense that we colonists have been treated like subjects, not with the pride we deserve? Or even low motives, like wanting to defend our property and increase it or protect slavery or whatever. I certainly think you can give an account of the American Revolution. It's one that I believe in, where the highest possible motives motivate, most of the founders who are involved in it. And I think that's the kind of account that Plato would reach for.
Moving on, Gary will moderate Disputations 3 and 4.
Thank you, gentlemen. So for Disputation 3, the architecture of the state and the soul, the regime and the men who constitute it. So our third question related to that disputation is about direction. Basically, what shapes what? The regime or the soul? Both Plato and Jefferson argue at different moments in both directions. Sometimes the regime shapes the soul, sometimes the soul shapes the regime. Take Plato. Most of Book 8 is the regime shaping the soul. Each kind of city breeds its own kind of man. The regime seems to stamp the citizen. But Plato also runs it the other way. The city is born out of human need. No one is self-sufficient, so we gather together and the city forms a response. So souls come first. Jefferson does something similar. In his 1813 letter to Adams, the soul shapes the regime. There's a natural aristocracy of virtue and talent given out by nature, and the best government is simply the one that gets those men into office. But turn to the notes of the state of Virginia, query 19, and it reverses. The farmer, working his own land, grows an independent soul, while dependence, he says, suffocates the germ of virtue. There, your mode of life forms your character, or the arrangement makes the man. So the question I have is, which has the stronger effect, the regime shaping the soul or the soul shaping the regime?
Great. I think I get to go first. We're just alternating, which is the right way for equals to rule. So I think I'm getting the better deal. But anyway, all right. So yeah, great question, Gary. And this is one of these perennial questions that we like to wrestle with, and we turn to philosophers for guidance on them and so on. So Socrates is going to say both of these are obviously true. In the public, the text that I'm briefing today. So the regime shapes the soul. Let's start there. What is a regime? Plato would say that a regime is a way that a human group orders itself, and it orders itself around a belief, a shared belief in what's good. Democracies believe that humans are equal and free, and therefore pursuing more equality and more freedom are good things, right? Oligarchy thinks that wealth is good, so pursuing more and more wealth is a good thing, and so on. So he wants to say that each group pursues a certain vision of what the good is, and shapes people accordingly. So if you're born into an oligarchy, you're going to grow up thinking wealth is great. If you're born into a democracy, you're going to start thinking freedom, and equality are great. And the education you receive is going to be shaped by that. And not just the education in school, but all the culture around you. So all of us who have been born into a democracy start life thinking that equality and freedom are good things, right? And we have to, revise those opinions, but we have a definite starting point. So it's undeniable, I think Socrates would say, and I think we'd agree, that the regime, understood in that way, shapes the way we understand the world. On the other hand, nature matters, says Socrates, right? And maybe in two ways that are important for us to keep track of. One is, as you know, my Jeffersonian colleague I think is going to speak to in a second. Nature gives us, people with different capacities. Some are really smart, some are really tall, some are really, whatever, right? These differences, many of them, seem to come from nature. In another way, too, nature kind of shapes things in that we aren't born with opinions. We human beings are born really needy and incapable of taking care of ourselves. We need to be instructed in all sorts of ways about the world. So society is constantly being besieged by barbarians in the form of infants who don't know anything and are just governed by their desires and are attacking institutions, right? And have to be acculturated and educated into those institutions. So nature really matters. And Socrates, I think, is useful as a corrective to some of our opinions insofar as he says, nature really does matter. Like, don't forget about nature. In particular, natural inequality. The fact that some human beings seem to be suited by nature for certain forms of excellence. LeBron James, even though he trained very, very hard throughout his whole life, right? And no one should ever take that away from him, whatever. Also is naturally suited to be an excellent basketball player in a way that I and Dr. McDonald are not naturally suited to it. So Socrates says, wonderful. Track those natural inequalities, treat them as gifts from the gods, and try to build a society that welcomes them and makes the most out of them, as opposed to suppressing them and denying that they exist. So a little bit of both, I think, but I think his useful provocation to us is do not forget about natural inequality.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the basketball team. I'm pretty sure I'd get picked last. I think you'd get picked before I would, Dr. Liebert. But where to begin? I mean, it's worth pointing out that Jefferson believed that people were equal in some ways and not equal in others. And I think it's a shame that a lot of people misunderstand the claim being made in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson and the other members of the Continental Congress were arguing that people were equal in their natural rights. They have an equal right not to be killed. They have an equal right to the fruit of their labor. They have an equal right to safety and happiness. They don't have the right to have those things provided for them, but they have a right, not to be murdered, not to be stolen from, that sort of thing. Civil rights are a different topic. And even today in 2026 in the United States, we don't have equal civil rights. 17-year-olds are not allowed to vote. People who are not U.S. citizens are not allowed to vote. In many places, felons are not allowed to vote. So there are distinctions made even now. But I think what made Jefferson ahead of his time was the belief that there is so much untapped capacity for excellence out there. And maybe his status as an American allowed him to see that. I mean, we were so different from Europe. This was a time, before the market revolution, before, the economy really took off, before transportation advancement allowed for specialization and the unbounded creation of wealth that we have enjoyed since about 1800. This was a time where wealth was denominated essentially in land. And only in America were we creating more of it, right? I mean, only in America did we have the capacity to push farther and farther west. And that provided people who came to America from Europe with unbounded opportunities compared to the people, back in the old world. So Jefferson could see people advancing. I saw young Washington last night for the second time. It's awesome. You all have to see it. And a nice thing about seeing it for the second time is you pick up on the little details. Well, Washington, when he was at Fort Necessity, was elevated to the rank of colonel because a man named Joshua Fry fell off his horse and died of his injuries. Now, Joshua Fry, that fall off of a horse not only created a path for George Washington to be commander of the Virginia Regiment, and then to be tapped later on as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, it also provided an opportunity for Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's dad, to take the seat in the House of Burgesses that Colonel Joshua Fry had occupied. And by creating a path for Jefferson's dad, it created a path for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's dad was in many ways a lot like George Washington. He was a self-made man. He was born into sort of junior varsity aristocracy. He married up into the Randolph family. He rose through military service. He rose through the acquisition of land and moving to a part of Virginia, Albemarle County, which was sort of on the edge of the frontier. And so Jefferson is, impressed by his father, impressed by all of the upward mobility that he sees around him. But he's also depressed by the existence of slavery and the profound inequality that the entire world, certainly not just America. I mean, America was so much better than most of the world, but the profound inequality that existed everywhere in the 18th century. And so Gary, when he wrote that passage in the notes on Virginia that you read about how those who labor on the earth are the chosen people of God, because farmers are hardworking. If they own their own land, they answer to no one. That allows them to be independent of means. That allows them to be independent of mind. They're not under anyone's thumb. They have built-in incentives to be good neighbors. I mean, they're almost literally rooted in the earth. So, if a neighbor wants to borrow a tool, they're going to loan the neighbor the tool. If they borrow something from a neighbor, they're going to, return the tool in good order and without being asked twice, because they know that their reputation in a community like this matters. And all of that hard work, all of that virtue, all of that independence is going to pay off. But I think we should take note that when Jefferson idealizes the yeoman farmer, he's excluding two types of people. One type would be enslaved people who not only don't own their own land, they don't even own their own bodies. So that's tremendously unjust. And he's also excluding people like himself, who, thanks to the upward mobility of his father, was born into a particular class in Virginia where, Jefferson's first memory, he later recorded, was being carried on a pillow, looking up into the face of one of his parents' slaves. It was against the law to emancipate your slaves in Virginia. That Jefferson remembered trying to change that law in 1769, but his proposal went down in defeat. For half of his life, it's not even legal in Virginia to emancipate slaves. So he too was born into this, profound system of inequality. But I think in the West, with all of this land, and with societies that we can shape and we can create according to our small r Republican principles, there was opportunity for both equality as well as upward mobility that no one had ever yet imagined.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. McDonald, for that in-depth historical context. That actually creates a perfect segue for our fourth disputation, so I really appreciate that. The fourth disputation is nature. All men are created equal, the natural aristocracy, golden souls and the noble lie, and racism and slavery. So Socrates, he utilizes the noble lie in Plato's Republic to create social harmony and to designate roles within society. He describes a story where citizens are told their metal-based natures, whether that be gold, silver, bronze, iron, and that they originate from the earth / the gods, therefore establishing a stable social hierarchy. The noble lie unifies the city, binding citizens to the common good and their specific roles without relying solely on continuous coercion. Jefferson argues in his 1813 letter to John Adams that there is a natural aristocracy of virtue and talents, and that nature gives out these virtues and talents unevenly. Both place men within a hierarchy, but one claims that this requires a lie, while the other argues it happens naturally. So I have a question for each of you. So for Plato, is the myth of different meddled souls a myth, or is it a true account of natural inequality just made by Socrates into a tale? And for the Jeffersonian perspective, if Jefferson believes in a natural aristocracy, is all men are created equal the noble lie of our specific regime?
I think, Rob, it's your turn to go first, isn't it?
Third,
We
well, I
have
just
to follow
spoke,
this
so
norm. We have no
all
other
right, all
rule
right.
guiding us. The Credo tells us we have to obey laws.
Well, my answer is pretty simple, and I in a way almost provided it. So sorry about that, Gary. I don't know if it was a great segue or if I stepped on this question, but
All good.
all men are created equal in terms of their natural rights. And I think Jefferson also believed that, people do have, in some ways, maybe not always, not only inalienable rights, but also unlimited potential. It's incredible what people can achieve if they are given a decent opportunity to do so. I mean, one of the things that Jefferson pushed after the Declaration of Independence was passed was, like John Adams, Jefferson went back to his home state. He went back to Virginia and he tried to reform the laws. And one of the laws that he proposed in 1779 was his bill for the general diffusion of knowledge, which would have essentially created a system of education within Virginia. I mean, Jefferson thought that education was in some ways the great equalizer, or at least the great opportunity provider. Back in his time, sons of the aristocracy were able to receive formal tutoring or formal education, eventually go to the College of William and Mary or go to the College of New Jersey, as James Madison did. But what Jefferson hoped was that there would be publicly funded education for all free boys and girls for 3 years, and they would be taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and that this would equip them not only to flourish as individuals, but also to flourish as citizens, that they would be able to be engaged citizens who could watch their government, who could sort of jealously guard against the government encroaching upon their liberties or gaining too much power. And then from that group, the most talented boys would advance to what he called grammar schools, but we might think of it as sort of a middle school, where most of the parents of these boys would pay for their tuition, but there would be free tuition reserved for, truly deserving and truly needy young men. And there, the learning would be more advanced. And from that group, the best and the brightest would be able to go to the College of William and Mary, or later, when he had the idea for the University of Virginia, the University of Virginia. So I think he viewed education as, a great opportunity provider. And it's interesting that while this bill did not pass, over time, in Virginia and elsewhere, Jefferson's vision came to fruition. And it would be fun to bring him, to the present. And I think a couple of your questions are going to invite us to imagine, what he would think if he were around in 2026. I'd be very curious to hear what his thoughts were on the state of public education in America. And I wonder if he might refine some of his ideas in response to, the realities that have emerged.
So I'm really glad we've come around to this letter on the wards and the school system that he proposes, because I would love to focus on that a little bit more. And I'm not sure that it's totally foreign to the spirit of Plato's Republic, which is an interesting point of contact between them. But let me begin by just heightening the contrast. So the section of this book that Gary's calling our attention to, The Noble Lie, essentially says that all human beings are created unequal and endowed by their creator with certain very different capacities that should be reflected in society. So we should understand the city, Socrates says, as if, everyone before they were born was in the earth and they had some god mixing a metal with their soul. And then when they got into society, they ended up either in the, one of these three strata that Socrates describes, the rulers, the guardians or warriors, or the craftsmen, depending on the metal that they've had mixed with their soul. So that myth is doing a few things in the course of the book. I mean, it's very different, than our founding, account that we're created equal and endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights. It's a justification of social hierarchy, not of equality. But it's a myth that Socrates presents as reflecting the truth of things, not as a lie meant to manipulate people necessarily, but as meant to reflect the truth of things in a way that can be socially useful. He suggests to us that all societies require certain kinds of myths, or truths expressed in poetic or mythical form. And that's an interesting thing to meditate on. I think there's a lot of truth to that, in fact. But in any event, it's supposed to reflect this truth about human beings that we come in these three different, kinds, according to Socrates. but also to reflect the fact, as you said, Gary, that we all come from the same place and therefore have a kind of fraternity with one another. We all come from the same soil in his account. And importantly, the myth is supposed to justify social mobility. And this, I think, is maybe the most, the part of it that tracks most closely with Jefferson's proposal in the schools. Because Socrates' idea is that there's a natural tendency for parents to want their social status to be passed on to their kids. It's a very, very strong thing. Those of you who don't have kids yet maybe haven't experienced it fully, but you definitely will, right? You really, really want your kids to have every privilege in life. And so his idea is that you're going to have some really talented people born to the lower classes in the society. And in order for the society to be just, they have to be rulers because they're talented. Similarly, you're going to have some people born to rulers in the society who are not, naturally suited to be rulers, and they should be, demoted, so to speak. So the myth gives you a way of justifying that kind of social mobility to ensure that the city is rooted in nature and not in social privilege. And I think that's an important dimension of it. Now, the society that Socrates ends up proposing is rigidly meritocratic. Not meritocratic in the sense of whoever passes the SAT and is good at math and verbal reasoning or whatever gets to be on top, but in the sense of whoever's most virtuous gets to be on top. It struck me reading this passage from Jefferson that Dr. McDonald just analyzed for us, that Thomas Jefferson is being pretty rigidly meritocratic too. And I'm not even sure that his understanding of merit is all that different from Plato's, and that he's not just looking for pure intellectual firepower, but to some degree, high character too, and rigidly selecting the best of the best with a view to those qualities. Is that like a fair read of his proposal for the schools?
I think that's very right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, maybe we don't have much to disagree about there. That's good.
Well, perfect. Then we'll move on to disputation number 5, and we'll be handling that one. Take it away, Will.
So Plato's Socrates begins his founding of the just city with a discussion on music and poetry and gymnastics. And the first act of the founder is the oversight of education, ensuring the proper balance of gymnastics and music, and censorship against the enchantment of morally problematic poems like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Against this stands Jefferson, who claimed to Benjamin Rush in 1800, quote, eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of men. This is carved inside the Jefferson Memorial, and who promised Dupont de Nemours in 1816 that, quote, enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and oppressions of the body and mind will vanish like evil spirits at the dawn of day. So 2 questions. What views, if any, do we find simply intolerable? Is there a legitimate form of censorship? And 2, can the many be enlightened through the same education as the few, to be taught to see the forms?
So Socrates would say no to that last question. I think that's an interesting point of, again, provocation where we can argue with him if we want. He would also not recommend that you see Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. There may be like a few minute clips that are good for your soul to watch, but the rest of it, really don't watch it. Anyway, 1 star as far as Socrates is concerned. He proposes a rigid system of censorship. I think the best way to get into, to overcome our initial aversion to that, which I think is, generally a good thing to be averse to censorship, I would say. But he's proposing an educational program first and foremost. So in the same way that Jefferson, when he's, laying out the curriculum of the University of Virginia, certainly does not say, well, look, just put every single book that's ever been written in that library, right? And let them read whatever they feel like, like no required classes, no majors, no core curriculum, they'll just let them free, right? It's not, a responsible way, I think, to set up a university. And although I'm not speaking in any way on behalf of West Point, I will say that, having a core curriculum and lots of requirements is generally pretty good. It's a way of doing education. And Socrates agrees. So he thinks, you can say with some confidence the sorts of ideas that especially young people can be exposed to in a way that shapes their character in a good way. And you can be, fairly confident that some things will shape their character in a bad way. In particular, he talks about theology here. He says if you grow up thinking that gods are fickle, vindictive, desirous, always messing around with mortals and then this sort of thing, it's actually not good for you. It tends to, foster a view of yourself where you think that kind of behavior is okay, right? Even, so that sort of thing, right? That matters. Getting the basic cultural models, the basic kind of books and ideas that especially young people are exposed to, all of that matters. And I think you can accept the force of that argument without necessarily concluding that, for, well-educated 40-year-olds, you shouldn't see Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, although Socrates does take it that far. So I'll stop there.
I haven't seen The Odyssey. I guess I won't now. Wow.
You should just watch Young Washington a third time, Dr. McDonald. That's a better case.
Maybe I'll do that. Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, as Dr. Liebert points out, in designing education, there is obviously going to be some selection. I mean, there are only so many hours in the day. There are only so many years that a person can devote his or her life to learning full time. You have to be selective. You have to, strive to put in front of people the texts, the ideas, the controversies that you think are going to be the most useful to them. So certainly there needs to be a selection process. And Jefferson grappled with this actually when he was creating the University of Virginia. I mean, he selected books for the library. There were certain books that he didn't want to be in the library, and Madison had to talk him into including them. And he finally gave in, So he did want people to be exposed to a lot of different and competing ideas. Of course, Jefferson was a strong supporter of the national government not engaging in censorship. We might remember the 1798 Sedition Act that was signed into law by President John Adams during the quasi-war with France. I mean, the ink was barely dry on the Bill of Rights, which had been ratified in 1791. What was it about Congress shall make no law that John Adams didn't understand? Mm-hmm. But I think Jefferson would say that there's room for social stigma to sort of control the left and right guardrails of the ideas that we will embrace and entertain and consider to be admittable to discussion in an enlightened world. So I think that's the case as well. And then I want to say at the very beginning of the question, you brought up like dancing and music and stuff like that. And I'll just point this out. I think that can be very important to education. Certainly Jefferson believed so. And there's this very underappreciated sort of back of the napkin plan for a military academy that Jefferson sketched out, we think in about 1793, where he lists the different professors who he wants to hire. And among the different faculty, he wanted someone to teach fencing, someone to teach dancing, someone to teach gymnastics. I mean, I think he looked at character development as not just an intellectual thing, but also a physical thing as well. And maybe by cultivating people's tastes. I mean, he certainly did that at the University of Virginia, where with great care and great intention, he designed the original buildings for the grounds of the University of Virginia to reflect specific kind of classical architectural styles. So he wanted those to be on display so that the tastes of the students at the University of Virginia would be cultivated and elevated.
I can just jump in. We're discovering all these wonderful points of agreement between these two authors who are supposed to be in disputation with one another. So Socrates, of course, took dancing and music very, very seriously. Too would absolutely, did actually. He's formulating a military academy in the Republic because it's primarily the training of the guardians, that he's doing. And he says that they have to be very well versed in music, both, culture broadly, but literal music too. So anyway, so even if it's the case that Plato didn't have, I think in a way it's more remarkable that they have these points of agreement without Jefferson having actually read or cared for Plato, right? In a way, it's like the sincerest possible form of like flattery and endorsement, I think.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right, thank you very much. Gary will moderate Disputation 6.
Disputation 6, the Philosopher-King and the Natural Aristocrat, the measure of an excellent man. So Plato's Philosopher-King does not want to rule. He has to be compelled back into the cave. And Plato believes a city is best governed when its rulers are least eager to hold office. Jefferson's natural aristocrat differs in that he has to be found, raked out of the rubbish, and then elected. Based on your specific line of reasoning, the reasoning of Plato and the reasoning of Jefferson, what specifically makes the most excellent man? And is this excellent man the most fit to rule?
It's a fascinating question. What's really interesting is some of the people on this Zoom call were students of both Dr. Liebert's and mine in a course that we taught called XH200 about 4 or 5 years ago. And we talked about some of these issues. And I think one of the first essays that we had everybody read was called Fame and the Founding Fathers by Douglas Adair. And, I can't off the top of my head do that essay full justice, but he pointed out that one of the greatest things that a person can aspire to was to be a statesman and to be the creator, the founder of a republic. This generation got to live that experience. But even beyond it, they understood that the generation that would follow would engage in a real amount of reinvention and refounding. Our government, well, I should say our governments on the state level and the federal level were all endowed with mechanisms by which the people could not only change their laws, but also amend their constitutions. And I think there was a real hope that Americans would engage in self-government, not only on the individual level, but also on the community level. One of the things that got Jefferson so excited about expansion into the West was we could sort of leave aristocracy behind and be in this sort of, and it really came true. The Midwest is an awesome place, right? In part because you don't have to worry about, is your last name a Randolph or Fairfax or what have you. And instead, you just work hard and you farm and you engage in your community. Jefferson described ward republics where people would have the ability to sort of, practice their skills in government by leading their communities, on the board of education, on the town council. And then from there, maybe you would go to the state legislature. And then from there, maybe you would be elected to Congress or more. So Americans had all these fantastic kind of training wheels that would allow people of character to prove themselves to their fellow citizens and be elevated to ever increasing positions of power. And it succeeded maybe even beyond Jefferson's wildest hopes. There's a terrific book by a scholar named Joyce Appleby, who passed away a couple of years ago, called Inheriting the Revolution. And she focuses mainly on the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the early republic. And she notes that there are all these civic organizations that are created, and they create their own constitutions and they elect their own officers. So in this, wonderful way, America very quickly evolves a very rich civic society that allows people to participate, to contribute according to their talents, to make the most of themselves, as well as try to promote the interests of their community. And I'll just wrap up by saying, Dr. Liebert and I are probably at this very moment maybe 150 feet away from each other. We live in the same neighborhood in this incredible village called Cornwall-on-Hudson, which some of you are familiar with. And we've got it all. We've got the garden club. We have Little League. We have scouts. We have church organizations. We have neighbors who are on the board of education, who have run for local office. This is real, and this exists in America still to this day. And I think it's maybe one of the secret ingredients of our success so far with this ongoing experiment in self-government.
And I fully agree with everything Dr. McDonald just said before I put my Plato hat back on. But so everyone who is capable should return to the Department of Social Sciences and teach, or Department of History. That's okay too if you go there. And you can live in Cornwall-on-Hudson and participate in this glorious ward republic that we have going. You come to the school board meetings with me and Dr. McDonald. It would be a lot of fun. Okay, but Plato hat back on. So one of the most distinctive arguments in Plato is that our souls are not fundamentally made for politics. So he describes the human soul as being, and here I'll just speak very quickly and brusquely about things that deserve a lot more care and how they're expressed. But the basic picture that Plato gives of the soul is that the soul is love. Fundamentally, the soul is love. But there are many objects that the soul loves in order of ascent. There's power, the ability to manipulate other people. There's pleasure. There's wealth. There's honor, understood as the good opinion of other people. And then there's wisdom. And he says that the highest love that the soul has by nature is wisdom, which means to know not just the ephemeral stuff, not just to master the intricacies of like particular subjects or whatever, but really to know the permanent things. And of the permanent things, the highest thing. The highest thing he describes as the good. So our soul longs for knowledge of the good, and it's distracted from that pursuit that's proper to it by all of these other false goods that appear to our soul as good. That's the reputation, the wealth, pleasure, and power, that sort of stuff. When a human soul is able to pursue what it really longs for and to build a life around that, he says, it's fulfilling in such a way that the soul doesn't want to do other things. So the best soul, the highest soul, then wants to contemplate the good and to philosophize, and not to be distracted from doing that by the sorts of concerns that come up when you participate in political life. So that's an argument for Plato about why we shouldn't, if we know what's good for us and we're capable of it, shouldn't be all that concerned with politics. Now, that said, when you look at Plato's actual life, which he doesn't present to us much in the dialogues, but does in a letter that almost certainly is authentic to him, and in other sources that we have about him, he didn't live out in the desert, in the lotus position, kind of staring up at the sky, right? That was not the way of life that he lived. Contemplating the good didn't mean that. And it actually didn't exactly mean the way of life he depicts with Socrates, too, where he kind of wander into the public square and, just ask people annoying questions. Plato lived, he was a surprisingly political person. He traveled on 3 occasions out to Sicily to try to educate a tyrant, unsuccessfully. He founded an academic institution called the Academy. He shares that with Jefferson. He wrote, which wasn't as, probably for his own personal edification, but to teach other people. We have access to him primarily through his writings. He certainly knew that he was doing something fundamental, potentially world-changing, in writing down philosophy and allowing it to be passed on in the way that it was. So he leaves us, I think, facing a really interesting question. On the one hand, that argument that he gives us for the soul's highest calling being wisdom seems, I think, quite powerful. It's one that I think is basically right. On the other hand, exactly how that cashes out into a way of life, is, I think, something that he, seems to have wrestled with. And it didn't seem to have one unitary answer, right, in terms of how he actually pursued it.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We will now move on to disputation number 7 by Will.
So there's a seeming contradiction on Jefferson where he objected on Washington's cabinet against a national military academy. He despised the Society of the Cincinnati for smuggling in a hereditary officer caste into his republic. And he also feared the potential tyranny and economic deprivation caused by standing armies. And yet on 16 March 1802, he signed the Military Peace Establishment Act, directing that a corps of engineers shall be stationed at West Point and shall constitute a military academy. He seems to have meant West Point to republicanize an elitist officer corps by schooling students of all backgrounds in mathematics and engineering. And even today, all graduates of West Point receive a bachelor in science, not in art. Plato's guardians also get mathematics and astronomy. Glaucon mentions that these subjects are clearly useful for the activities of war, but Socrates says that the real question is whether the study draws the soul upward and makes it easier to see the idea of the good. Plato's king is a philosopher who seeks knowledge of the eternal forms for its own sake. And he says geometry is, quote, knowledge of the eternally existent, of the good itself. So would Plato consider us military officers, guardians, or men of bronze? And would Jefferson approve of West Point as it exists today?
All right, I get to go first. Yeah, you should study math and everything else you study for the sake of your soul, not because. So you shouldn't study math because it gives you the capacity to manipulate matter and make like silicon think and that sort of stuff. That's not the fundamental reason. The reason is it puts you in touch with numbers and teaches you that there's no order outside of yourself that your mind can participate in. And that's a wonderful kind of education in the situation your soul actually is in. And it leads you towards higher pursuits, even higher than math, like studying the good. But even gym, Plato would say, should be studied for the soul's sake. So when you go out for a run or you push yourself to a PR in a bench press, what you're doing is telling your body rather, that your soul is in control. That even though your body is saying, don't push yourself anymore, this is unpleasant, your soul is saying, I am in control. We're going to achieve this PR. We're going faster on the 2 mile, right? So even gym is a kind of soul training, not fundamentally about the body. And all education is properly framed that way, I think Socrates would say, at least based on the Republic. As far as whether military officers are guardians or whatever, I would say that one of the things I think you can take from a serious engagement with Plato is just the challenge of it's in a way kind of up to you whether you're someone who is motivated primarily by what he would consider low, necessary things like money, retirement bonuses, this sort of thing. Fine, okay, yeah, everyone's motivated by those things. But hopefully there's, another way you relate to your vocation, right? Which is not just how to get, half colonel pay for life or whatever, right? But is something about really achieving a kind of virtue, a kind of excellence that you identify that is you, you know what I mean? It's not just something that you're talking about or whatever, but you really care about and want to get better at and share with other people too, those you lead and those who are around you. So I think that's a very noble vision of what it is to be a guardian or a military officer, and it's one that Socrates puts front and center.
Yeah, so as far as Jefferson and the establishment of West Point, as you point out, Will, it's true. When West Point was proposed during Washington's presidency, and Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, and the rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton had already begun, he tried to pump the brakes, and he questioned whether this was constitutionally allowed or allowable. And yet, this is when Jefferson was on the back of that napkin, drawing up plans for a military academy. I think the best read of that situation is that he didn't want Hamilton to shape the military academy. In some ways, he thought that it was too important, and he didn't trust Hamilton to create the type of military academy that would promote American liberty and not endanger American liberty. Jefferson was by no means a pacifist, but he also wasn't a fan of war, and he very much feared that we would get drawn into European wars that would lead to, all of the things that could undermine liberty. I'll quote Madison, who I think in 1791, maybe 1795, said, "Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is the most to be feared because it sows the seed of every other." And then he listed debts, taxes, standing armies, encroachments on civil liberty, the growth of government power. So Hamilton, in a memo that he wrote to Washington in 1783, metaphorically referred to British Canada on our left and Spanish America on our right, which is so revealing because it shows Hamilton's orientation. When he is facing forward, he's looking at Europe and he's trying to, model America maybe after Great Britain, which isn't a crazy aspiration, since at that point, Great Britain was the most powerful and the richest and arguably the second freest nation on the planet. But of course, when Jefferson saw the future, his ambitions were in the West. And I think that's where West Point comes in. So there are a couple of different scholarly interpretations of the founding of West Point by Jefferson in 1802. And I think they're all probably complementary. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So one interpretation is that Thomas Jefferson was trying to create, at the same exact time that he was creating West Point, a national university. And he did believe that a constitutional amendment would be required for a national university. Washington thought the same thing. Washington called for a national university. Jefferson continued to make that call. But that Jefferson established West Point as a constitutionally allowable component of what would eventually be a national university. And with Jonathan Williams, the first superintendent of West Point, Jefferson corresponded about the possibility of moving West Point down to Washington, D.C., where the national university would be formed. So, the school of the this military academy that focused on engineering would be a college within that national university. By the same token, I think you could make a good argument, and I've made it, that West Point pointed west. So at the very same time that Jefferson is establishing West Point and helping to guide things like its curriculum, he is devising a curriculum for Meriwether Lewis as he gets ready to lead the Corps of Discovery out west to explore, what would soon be the Louisiana Purchase. And Jefferson sent Lewis, who was his secretary. He was an Army captain, but he was like a White House aide at the time. And there was no one who was qualified to lead the Corps of Discovery. But he thought that Meriwether Lewis had a decent shot of learning and the raw talent to be able to do it. So Jefferson sent him to his friends, mostly in Philadelphia, who were members of the American Philosophical Society. So that was essentially a scientific organization. It was established in 1743 by Ben Franklin. And Jefferson had Lewis meet up with specific individuals who could teach him, how to navigate by looking at the stars. Art was important because he wanted Lewis to be able to make good maps, as well as provide illustrations of animal species that he encountered out there. French was important because it was a language spoken by many Native Americans, and there could be sort of a chain of translation if you had someone with you who knew French. Botany, anatomy, medical care, all of this is, designed to make it possible for Lewis to successfully lead the Corps of Discovery. And what's exciting is a lot of those subjects and even some of the people who Jefferson had Lewis meet with ended up eventually being in the West Point curriculum or on the West Point faculty. So those two types of education track really well. So West Point, I think, pointed west. That was Jefferson's vision for the Army. We weren't going to be fighting a bunch of Europeans. Instead, we were going to be conquering, consolidating, charting, and establishing, American civilization on this continent. And the Army had a very important role for that. And then the third interpretation of the establishment of West Point, and again, I think these are all complementary. Remember that during the quasi-war with France, Alexander Hamilton was given the opportunity to create what was called the New Army. Washington was officially in charge of it, but really it was directed by Alexander Hamilton, and he had filled it with a whole bunch of Federalist political allies. So Jefferson sincerely questions the fidelity of the American military. And so the American Military Peace Establishment Act of 1802 not only creates West Point, but it also dramatically reduces the Army, I think, so that Jefferson could purge it of some of the worst Federalist officers. And then there's a historian named Ted Crackle who argues that Jefferson considered the political affiliations of prospective cadets' families when he was making appointments. So he was trying to balance out the Federalist presence with also a Jeffersonian Republican presence. I will say Jefferson doesn't push that too far. Jonathan Williams, who was the first superintendent appointed by Jefferson, was a moderate Federalist. One of the cadets who Jefferson appointed to West Point, to the chagrin of all successive generations of West Point cadets, was Sylvanus Thayer, who was also a moderate Federalist. So Jefferson, wasn't rigid in, imposing a political litmus test. But certainly this did allow the Army, as it then naturally grew, to have a much more apolitical flavor to it. And, I think Jefferson would be very impressed if he were to come back to West Point today to see that we retain that apolitical spirit and bring in Americans from, all walks of life and all parts of the country, which he also endeavored to do. A number of the people who he initially appointed were from the Louisiana territory, including people who were like ethnically half French and half Native American. The second cadet appointed to West Point was a Jewish guy from New York. So, I think Jefferson believed that the military should basically embrace all types of different Americans and be a source of unity for the nation, and not become a source of division or a threat, to the liberty that the government was created to protect in the first place.
Thank you. Moving on to Disputation 8. So some classic Platonic tensions are the conflicts between the philosopher and the city, between tyranny and wisdom. From a great reader of Plato, Leo Strauss, quote, "If wisdom or virtue is the highest good, the fatherland or the city cannot be the highest good. If he has to choose between a corrupt fatherland and a well-ordered foreign city, the philosopher may be justified in preferring the foreign city," unquote. And this is in conflict with the virtues of the citizen, patriotism, piety, obedience to norms. And indeed, philosophy has often been the criminal study of nature, of universal truths outside of the city, of the natural sciences and reasoning that undermines the gods, the myths, the laws, the nomos of the city. And tyranny is similarly criminal, a regime of rule outside and against law and against nomos, the type of man willing to break the law of Crito. Thus, the Platonic teaching that the philosopher and tyrant are not opposite types, but the two potential destinations of the one and the same erotic, desiring, passionate nature, the same longing, turned upward to wisdom or turned loose on the city. And in Book 8, it actually gives us the birthplace of the tyrant. Quote, "Tyranny naturally arises from democracy, and the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme form of liberty." And Book 9 gives us the man of limitless desire, drunk without wine, a slave of his own eros. And Plato's remedy for this erotic man was directing him to the quest for wisdom. But as you mentioned, Dr. Liebert, 3 times he sailed to Syracuse to make a philosopher out of the tyrant Dion, and 3 times he failed. Jefferson's remedy is suspicion, eternal vigilance, a people jealous of their liberty, and a regime too weak to seize and make a tyranny. So the question is the philosopher and the tyrant the same type of man? And if so, how do we safeguard a democracy against the philosopher-tyrant, the erotic, passionate man?
Unfortunately, I guess it's my turn to go first. I wish Dr. Liebert could take. You're laughing. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I would say that, did Jefferson fear democracy? We all fear democracy. I mean, of course we do. And it's worth noting, every form of government should be feared. We all know the famous Churchill quote, right? Where he said democracy is the worst form of government with the exception of all the others. I mean, that's funny because there's truth to it. Democracy, can have excesses. I mean, Tocqueville, coined the term, I think, tyranny of the majority, but he certainly wasn't the first person to understand that concept. The people, oh gosh, what's the saying? Democracy is like, 5 wolves and 1 sheep voting on what to have for dinner. People can be really predatory through government. And the founding generation very much was concerned with that fact. I mean, that's why they created governments that checked and balanced and divided power. That's why they wanted people to be able to be critical consumers of information about their government. That's why they wanted, terms of office that were relatively brief and would give people the opportunity not to reelect people who abused their power. They knew that this is a perilous thing, but isn't monarchy perilous as well? How do you trust just one guy or just some class of guys who are unchecked to do the right thing? How can you be so sure that they too won't be selfish or or that they will be selfless? I mean, we spoke a little bit about the equality of people. I think Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Hamilton would all agree that one way in which we're all equal is we all possess the capacity not only to do great and virtuous things, but we all possess the capacity to sin and to do terrible things. So we needed to try to create systems and structures, as well as environments, to get back to an earlier question, that would cultivate the best in us, and hopefully screen out the worst.
Yeah, so I think Plato agrees with lots of those basic insights, and it ends up in kind of very different conclusions or kind of like startling claims, many of which will summarize. But the idea that all of us are prone to sin, have as part of our soul certain unruly desires. That's true for Socrates' account of the human soul, of tyrants, of desires people, but also of great philosophers. It's still the case that there's a kind of tending of your soul, kind of constant monitoring, that goes on. That's something like, I think, the same insight that Jefferson had. Socrates suggests to us that tyrants and philosophers are similar in certain respects that are kind of, startling, right? They're both unbound by convention or law. So the philosopher needs to pursue knowledge of nature wherever it goes, even if it leads them to doubt, certain pieties that surround them. Similarly, the tyrant is not bound by any pieties that surround him. So they're both kind of thinking outside of the law. They both point to the fact that the human soul is not exclusively bound by a particular city. We can travel to other cities. We can ask what human beings are independent of the city that they happen to be raised in. There's this capacity to not be defined by the city. I think that Socrates recognizes is just true, but is like visible most clearly in certain human types. And I think maybe the other interesting thing that Socrates says on this point is that you can imagine a human being who is so far superior to everyone, around him or her, he would say, at least in the Republic, that, you would want that person in control. That's like, at least as a theoretical kind of maximum possibility, a person of outstanding virtue who you'd want at the helm and would not want bound by law because the law would be, made by lesser types, let's say. I don't know that that's necessarily a very practically useful belief, but I don't know that Socrates intended it that way. Just to kind of heighten our awareness of the extreme forms of political excellence, like every other form of excellence. That idea, too, though, isn't totally foreign to American founders and certain very important, thinkers in America. I like to read in my American political thought courses, I'm sure I've read with many people on the call, Lincoln's Lyceum address, where he thinks through in wonderful, profundity, just what this type of human being, the kind of tyrant slash philosopher slash antinomian, whatever, like ruler, who might actually be justified in ruling and certainly wants to rule on his own, right? What that person is kind of like and how you deal with the challenges politically that human type presents. So it's not just Plato. It's thinkers in our own tradition too.
All right, moving on. Gary will moderate the last disputation.
Disputation 9. Technocracy, democracy, and liberalism. Rule by experts, rule by people, versus individual freedom. So Plato, gentlemen, seems to argue for rule by experts, to put it very simply. He states that ruling is a craft and the crew has no business overruling the navigator. Jefferson argues for rule by the people if they're educated, holding power in their hands, and if they choose their own rulers. Plato says that ends in tyranny. So our final question for both of you is, which is better, rule by experts or rule by people? And is individual freedom worth more than either?
Okay, so I get to go first now. Is this right? Okay, I'm not violating our norm. Yeah, so Socrates definitely suggests that rule by a few experts, I guess you could call them, is better than rule by a lot of non-experts. With the difference being that we shouldn't think of kind of masterful bureaucrat or technologist or whatever as the person we have in mind. At least so far as the Republic is concerned, it's the person of really outstanding virtue. And wisdom, but that's a little bit different, I think, than saying an expert or a technocrat or what have you. One thing that I'm struck by in reading the Jefferson readings that you arranged for this session is how similar in some respects Jefferson seems to be to some fundamental insights that Socrates presents. I mean, the idea that, for instance, that there is a natural aristocracy, that a regime is good insofar as it can highlight natural aristocrats and, let's say, demote the pseudo-aristocrats. This is a basic kind of Platonic insight, I think, as well as a Jeffersonian insight. I think they would primarily differ, I'd say, in the kind of institutions and mechanisms that they trust to get the natural aristocrats in positions of authority. It seems to me, but I'll defer in all things Jefferson and many other things to my colleague, Dr. McDonald, that Jefferson has a lot of trust in elections to do that. Plato considers elections an aristocratic institution too, actually, not so much in the Republic, but in other dialogue, the laws. He says that they're certainly more aristocratic than rule by lottery, which is, the primary way that Athens selects its officials. So elections are kind of aristocratic, but he doesn't seem to trust elections only, right, to preserve, to kind of recognize natural talent, cultivate it, and put it in a position where it can be authoritative. To the extent he points us to any institutions, it seems to be, private education, the kinds of encounters that individuals have with Socrates. Plato founds an institution, an academic institution called the Academy. We don't have the founding charter, but I like to think of it as being a kind of auxiliary to the city that is supposed to at least increase the probability that, natural aristocrats will be in a position of some kind of authority in the city. So, maybe the mechanisms are different, but the goal is strikingly, I would say, similar between these two people when they think about how, experts or outstandingly virtuous people should rule. Over to you, Dr. McDonald.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with the way the question is framed, and I think that Jefferson didn't believe that we should be ruled by experts. I think Jefferson fundamentally believed that free people ruled themselves as individuals, and one of the the great challenges of government throughout American history, but certainly Jefferson found it to be one of the great challenges of government in the 1790s, and even during his own presidency, was keeping a check on government and making sure that it didn't take on powers that weren't delegated to it through the Constitution, so that there would be plenty of room for people to make their own decisions about the vast majority of the questions in their life. And when it comes down to your preferences, you are the expert, right? I mean, you know how you balance different questions about what you want to do with your day, how you value your time. Do I want to mow the lawn or do I want to go to Five Guys? I mean, I want to do both, but what do I do? I need to mow the lawn, so I'm going to do that. That's probably not the best example, but I think you all get what I'm saying. I mean, Jefferson wanted to provide maximum space for individual Americans to have freedom over, their own decisions. But, he wasn't an anarchist. We were going to have a government. We needed leadership at various levels, and people in positions of authority did have to make decisions. I'll say that Jefferson, throughout his life, cultivated relationships with a lot of experts and a lot of different things. And I think one of the good things about Thomas Jefferson is he was humble enough to always reach out to people who he thought had particular expertise and seek their advice. Washington was famous for doing that as well. So I think leaders who are humble, I mean, that's a rare quality, but office holders who are humble and are able to seek advice from people who know what they're talking about is a very good thing. But to have this sort of technocracy, this progressive Wilsonian city manager type government, I shouldn't have said that because some of you don't know what I'm talking about, but a big push of the progressive era was the creation of all sorts of professional schools of government and the idea of civil service and essentially creating what became bureaucracies, where some people will say we have a fourth branch of government. I think Jefferson would be really hostile to that idea, and I think that's why Woodrow Wilson was so hostile to the ideas of Thomas Jefferson. He understood that just wasn't the thrust of the American founding, that the American founding was endeavoring to sort of maximize the degree to which individuals could make their own decisions about their own lives.
Thank you very much, sir. So that concludes our disputations. Just to make sure we respect these two fine professors' time, we did want to see if we had a couple questions from the audience, and we actually do have a question from Paul. If that's okay, if we could have Paul ask a question real quick, gentlemen. Let's see. It looks like we need to unmute Paul.
Gentlemen, I appreciate it. Just piggybacking off the Leo Strauss point, Given the explicit and implicit myth-making in the dialogues, what is the true Platonic metaphysics? Strauss and other interlocutors have demonstrated the dissonance between the exoteric and the esoteric Plato. So I'm sort of questioning what's the overall conclusion of these seemingly contradictory dialogues, or are they themselves a meta-dialogue between competing ideals? Accordingly, is the realm of the forms itself a noble lie presented to ensure a moral foundation for society, even if untrue?
Thanks, Paul. That's a really hard question. I'll tackle it, I guess, first, and then Dr. Nog can chip in. So, Strauss distinguishes, among a few different kinds of esotericism. Like there's a kind of esotericism where the writer fears persecution and has a secret teaching that has some content that could be expressed, in words clearly, but it's a dangerous message either for himself or for the recipient. And so it's coded in a certain way so that only people who should be able to understand it, can have access to it, right? So there's that kind of esotericism. There's another kind of esotericism he talks about, which is a kind of pedagogical esotericism, where, even though you might be able to tell like a student something directly, plainly, right? You understand it to be the job of the teacher to not do that because it's important for the student in order to learn the right way or to really like wrestle with the idea in the right way such that it's properly learned, right? To not state it directly, but to use, degrees of irony and misdirection and this sort of thing. I think there's almost certainly a good degree of the first kind of esotericism in Plato's works. But in terms of my own approach, I think it's useful to start with the assumption of pedagogical esotericism as being the primary way that Plato is educating us. And I think that that's the most useful starting point just because it resonates so well with the literary form that Plato uses. So the fact that he writes 35 dialogues, let's say, assuming they're all like authentic, maybe they aren't, I don't know. But 35 dialogues. He doesn't say, here's what I think about the world in the forms. Here it is. I hope you agree with me. I will lay out the arguments. But instead gives us this highly fragmentary view of things. And even in those dialogues, he's not the character. Socrates is. We know Socrates is identical to Plato because Socrates says you can't write philosophy in a written work of philosophy by a student Plato. For that and many other reasons, right? We know that they're not identical to one another. So what's going on there? Like, what do we make of the drama of the dialogue, the multiplicity of the dialogues, like all of these things? And it just seems to me that a very good starting point for that is to assume a kind of pedagogical esotericism, if you want to call it that. But basically, he's writing in such a way that the person reading really has to wrestle with the ideas, contradictory statements, right? And try to figure out what's true and what's false. So they're meant to kind of like nudge you, to provoke you into philosophy, at least as much as they are meant to encode a secret philosophical teaching that once you decode, you will have the truth. That's my take anyway.
That's a great answer.
I have nothing to add.
All right. Thank you, too. I think Kamak has another question.
Hello, gentlemen. Thanks very much for your time. And I want to say, if I had to pick a philosopher-king for the United States of America, your names would be at the top of the list. But my question, I'll keep it quick. If Plato or Jefferson were to come to the United States in 2026 and write a sort of democracy in America of the current day, what would their primary topics of conversation be? And what would be their biggest issues or concerns with the American system?
I'll take a quick swing
At that. I mean, if Jefferson were to come back today, I think he would be astounded and thrilled at the degree to which Americans of all different backgrounds, from all different continents of origin, had been allowed to make the most of their potential and proven themselves to be capable contributors to this great American experiment. I'm thinking specifically about African Americans. I mean, there's this famous passage in Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. It's really cringy. He talks about what he thinks are some physical differences. One is that Black people sweat more, Jefferson claims. And, he's such a smart man. And it doesn't hit him that maybe Black people sweat more because they're out in the fields working, right? while he's reading books inside. But he also, reflects on what he thinks are the sort of mental capacities of people from different parts of the world. This doesn't take away from their humanity. It doesn't take away from their equal natural rights. But super cringy also, he says, Black people seem to be okay at telling stories, but haven't demonstrated great powers of analysis or great competence in mathematics. I think he says specifically. And of course, like, it's such a dumb comment too, because it was against the law in Virginia to even teach an enslaved person to read. So I think he would be so happy to see that his apprehensions and his fears about the capacities of African Americans were not well founded. I think he would be very concerned about the size of American government, really on all levels, the degree to which the national government does, far more things than the people who ratified the Constitution envisioned. The fact that we have a $40 trillion debt, I think would horrify him. I mean, one of the things that he endeavored to do as president, and with some success, is, despite the splurge of purchasing Louisiana for $15 million, he was able to pay off one third of the national debt that he had inherited from the Washington and Adams administrations. So I think those would be his big concerns.
Yeah, I'll just give you two maybe Platonic chapters in this democracy in America thing. One bleak and one maybe more uplifting. So the bleak one is, Socrates in the Republic describes a democracy in decay, slouching towards tyranny. And he says the most remarkable thing about it is that it can't make even basic distinctions between better and worse or higher and lower. He says parents start to dress like their kids, that all of these important distinctions, between like people who are living well and people who are living poorly. It even gets to the point, he says, where you can't distinguish between humans and animals. And, but his basic idea, I think, just to go off of what Dr. McDonald was saying a second ago about like five guys and the lawnmower, is like when you have all of these options equally available to you, because human beings are the kinds of creature who need some guidance, towards good things and away from bad things. When you can do absolutely anything, Plato was very pessimistic that most people will, arrive at a virtuous way of life. So in that sense, it's much more authoritarian than someone like Jefferson is, much more pessimistic, I guess, about the way that goes. And I think he would, find at least some evidence, I'm sure, if he were trying to, apply his regime analysis to our own regime. The more uplifting thing, Socrates has an account of social mobility where he thinks that, there's a kind of natural aristocracy, that a just regime reflects it and gives opportunities for social privilege to be replaced by actual deserved, earned, natural, privilege, let's say. I think that is in some ways a loftier vision of social mobility than the one we typically use, which is basically, are you wealthier than your parents? Socrates would ask, are you more virtuous than your parents? And I think, he would probably find indications that still in our country, right, there are many avenues through which individuals can become more virtuous than their parents, more virtuous than the lot they were born into in life. And insofar as that's true, he would consider it a sign of our regime's justice and hopefully some optimism.
Cool. Last question from Caleb Anderson. Caleb, can you hear us? Okay, if not, if you can't figure out the audio, I guess like a basic question, kind of bringing it into the contemporary scene, is what regime, if any, would Plato consider the closest to his Republic, his city and speech today or in the past?
Go ahead, Rob.
That's one for Hugh.
Well, can you repeat the question? Well, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got it. What was the question?
So what regime, if any, today or in the past, would Plato consider the closest to his city and speech?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I can start. Like I think that in general, it's hard to identify like a single regime that follows everything that Socrates prescribed. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think it was fully intended for that kind of an application. I think you would probably look at periods where in a monarchy where an extraordinarily virtuous king happens to rule. We can think of what virtuous king that would be, but I think also he would be open to recognizing certain kinds of, let's say, porous aristocracies that are open to people rising up into them. There are moments, certainly in 18th century England, I think, when you could say that that is more or less true of British aristocracy. Similarly, I think there are times in the American regime when you can say that the people ruling are genuinely admirable, virtuous types, and there's the capacity for people to rise up into that situation. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable things about our founding generation. For instance, to think of someone like a Hamilton. You guys know the opening of the musical, so I won't repeat it here. But coming from nothing, right? And similarly, from all sorts of different places and achieving this remarkable thing that they did. So I would look at moderate aristocracies and then the occasional enlightened monarch as examples historically.
I'll use my last remaining bit of time to add my thanks. Dr. Liebert, did so at the beginning, but this has been a terrific conversation. And Will and Gary, I want to thank you guys in particular for putting so much effort into putting this together and starting this amazing organization. I mean, this is the sort of civic society that I think Jefferson, Tocqueville, who knows, maybe even Plato would have, really appreciated. And I saw your message, Will, that next month you were having as your guest General Petraeus. I mean, you are not aiming low. So I feel very honored to have been part of this first meeting. I'm sure Dr. Liebert does as well. So thank you for having us.
You're here. Thank you.
Thank you too. All right, Gary, do you want to close this out?
Yeah.
Wait, Will, Caleb just came up to say that
yes,
he might be able to get it to work now. And if not, Caleb, you can put the question in the chat and we can respond to it. And there.
Hey,
okay.
Can you all see me?
Yes, we
Can
can.
you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I'm sorry, guys. I'm in Iraq right now, so the network's a little bit shoddy, and so are the network permissions. So I had to switch to my phone. My question is actually 2 parts, but I've distilled it down to one just to respect y'all's time in case you need to get out of here. Kind of the lead-up question is off of, there was a comment that Dr. McDonald made about Jefferson really trusting elections as the means of putting the correct individuals into those positions of power. And one kind of strain of thought that I've recently been meditating on quite a bit is the idea that elections are perhaps not the means of putting the best people into power, but as assuring that when we have bad people in power, we can get rid of them, i.e. they are not somewhat like market mechanisms in the way that we search out the configuration space of ideology and political philosophy and put the best people into power, but we are just the safeguard of kicking people out to bring about the worst outcomes. And unfortunately, one of the reasons why I hopped on this call was because I don't know as much about Jefferson's thought or Plato's thought as I should. And I wonder if what we've been talking about tonight as the dialogue between democracy and aristocracy is a little bit tinged with this modern character, the character of our modern conversations that I think is a little bit tinged by the characterizations around markets and decentralized thinking producing good outcomes as opposed to looking for ensuring we don't have negative outcomes. And so I just want to elicit some thoughts from you, Dr. Liebert, or Dr. McDonald. Is it both in Plato and or in Jefferson that they believe that democracy would put in the best people in power? Or is it a mix of this, or is something different? Just looking for some clarification there.
I guess I'll
take a swing at that, Hugh, unless you want to go first. So, Caleb, I think, that's a really great insight, that, maybe we don't always elect the best people. I mean, sometimes we do, I think, but not always. And of course, there are a bunch of elections that precede having two candidates on the ballot, which is usually the way it is. There are caucuses, there are primaries. But it's really important for the people to have an opportunity to veto the presence of a particular leader, to not reelect that person. So I think, that is maybe a really good function of democracy, maybe even better than selecting the very best person from among the 350 million of us, right, in the first place. I would say about the founding generation that it's just worth noting they really didn't use the word democracy. I mean, that's a much more modern word. When the Federalists were trying to pillory Thomas Jefferson and his political alliance, they described the Jeffersonian Republicans as Democrats, because they really distrusted their, I think, much more careful and strict and classical definition of democracy. They spoke in terms of republicanism and a much more sort of filtered mechanism of consent. And so, I just think it's worth taking note of that, because it's important not to impose our own presumptions or our own use of terms onto theirs.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. McDonald's point. I think it's a nice distinction you make between selecting the most virtuous and like vetoing the most vicious. Let's put it that way, right? And elections do both of those. And vetoing the most vicious might, in fact, be the more important, way that elections work. I thought your market point was really interesting too, and just in case it's helpful to anyone listening, I'll say that the market mechanism I don't think is the predominant metaphor in the ancient sources for thinking about elections, but they do tend to think in terms of competitions. So if you think about like even athletic competitions are really front and center, I think, in how they think about these things. That there's something about seeing people go toe to toe, like in a debate, for instance, in front of the assembly, that reminds them of people like competing in a chariot race or in wrestling or something like this. And there's a way that competition can bring out the best of people, and display very clearly, like in a way that's not obvious before people start competing, who the best of them is. More by the end of the baseball game about who's better than you did at the very beginning. And there are ancient authors, just to plug my man Plutarch, who make a lot out of that and arrange their whole way of presenting great individuals through competitions, precisely so you can understand who's better than the other person. So it's not only markets, right? They clarify, it's actually like athletic competitions and other forms of competitions too. I think it's an excellent question. And since I guess this is the end, thank you again, Gary and Will, for this really amazing opportunity. It's pretty humbling to be the opening act for General Petraeus. I hope we didn't flub that too badly. But thanks again.
No, thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you so much for giving the time, Dr. McDonald, Dr. Liebert. We really appreciate it. Seriously, thank you for your insight and your wisdom. For everyone else that joined, thanks so much. The chat is in the group. Our Instagram's in the group. We really want to keep this going, have these important conversations moving forward. But once again, Dr. Liebert, Dr. McDonald, thank you so much for your time and for teaching us all so much tonight. Will and I will hang on for just a couple minutes if anyone wants to ask us anything or discuss anything moving forward. But once again, thank you very much, gentlemen.
thank you.